Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this industry-wide update on Bluetongue. I'm Mike Gooding. I'm Farming Systems Director at AHDB, and this is one of a number of webinars we've been running through this Bluetongue outbreak to keep you updated on the latest developments. We're very aware, of course, that the zones have expanded over the last couple of days, and we have over 300 people who have signed up for this evening's webinar. So we will cover some ground if you've been on these webinars before, but it's important that we get the basic detail out there and give you an update on the latest situation. Thanks to the AHD team for pulling everything together. And Emily, if you'd go to my next slide, that would be really helpful. So this evening's webinar is being recorded, and as with our previous webinars, what we've done is we've put them up through the website. So if you want to go back and to remind yourself of some of the questions and answers or some of the presentations, you're very welcome to do so. We know that's been very popular with people, and we will try and get it up within 24 hours of finishing today's webinar. Please keep an eye out on the AHDB website, and I'm going to talk you through some other areas where you can pick up information about the outbreak. And we'll hear from our speakers that we have with us this afternoon, and then spend as much time as we can answering your questions. I hope you're all familiar with this format, but on the top right-hand side of your screen, you should see a square box with a question mark in it. Please do add any questions that you have as we go through. The team are working their way in the background, and we'll try and sort of pull themes of questions together and answer as many of those as we can this evening. If we don't get to all of them, we will put up answers to questions, and we will notify everybody after the webinar who's registered to the link on the website for the recording of the webinar and the questions and answers. At the very end, of course, you'll get your obligatory feedback form as well. If you could fill that in, if there are any areas that you felt we haven't covered or you would really like to hear about in the future, it's really helpful if you can put those into that feedback form. Thank you, Emily. The next slide. Just to highlight one or two really useful points of contact for you. There's a QR code on the screen for you now, or a link which takes you to the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. There's a new feature on there that has literally just gone up, which is an explanation of all the different movement questions. It's actually very useful and starts with what are the most common questions that we're receiving about movement licenses. And as those areas move and expand, this has been a key piece of information. Emily, if you would go on one more. The next most important thing there is the Bluetongue hotline. That number, please jot it down, 024 7771 0386, and I think it should be behind me on the screen as well. That is the AHDB Bureau service. They man those phones during office hours, and if they're not able to answer your questions directly, they will steer you to the right place or find the answer for you. If you do phone up out of office hours, that team will get back to you if you leave your name, number, and a question. They're very good at responding, and it's been a very popular service, so please do jot that number down. There's the government website on how to spot and report Bluetongue, of course, critical. And then there's the AHDB website itself. Emily, if you would go forward a slide for me. This is the landing page on the AHDB website. If you find yourself there, you'll see in the middle of that screen the Bluetongue hotline box. If you click on that or follow the link directly to the Bluetongue area, there's a massive information on the AHDB website and links to other places to find that information. It's interesting. The three most common questions we are asked are: where are the outbreaks? What does it look like? And can I move my animals? And the website has been structured in a way to try and answer those questions as quickly and easily as possible. There's a very good interactive map. This is at the top of the website that helps identify where those areas are. Next slide, please, Emily. That actually takes us on to the APHA disease alerts. And I would encourage all of you, if you're not already subscribing to the disease alerts, to do so. This will either give you an email and or a text alert. I personally get both on my farming phone, and it is the quickest way to find out about what is happening in terms of disease areas and those alerts. It's a really a powerful service. Take a scan of that QR code, or again at the end of the webinar, you should be able to find it through any of the links that we're posting up. Okay, thank you, Emily. That's all the housekeeping as far as this evening is concerned. So look, let's get stuck into our three speakers. We have with us this evening Gordon Hickman. Gordon is Head of Exotic Disease Control at DEFRA. If you've been on these webinars before, Gordon is a familiar face. He'll give us an update on the outbreak of policy run through and talk a little bit about vaccinations. Then we'll hand over to Sascha van Helvoort. Sascha is Veterinary Head of Outbreak Delivery at APHA. And Sascha will talk to us about the clinical signs we should be looking out for on farm. And she'll be joined by Chris Sanders. Chris is Research Fellow in Veterinary Entomology at Pirbright. And Chris' particular specialism is midges, and he's got to talk to us a little bit about midges and what we can actually do about them. So if we could load up Gordon's slides, please, Emily, we'll move straight on to Gordon. I'll just remind you, if you can, all load up your questions in that box on the top right-hand side of your screen with the question mark in it. And we'll come back and we'll deal with as many of those questions as we can after our speakers. Hopefully, we have Gordon's slides appearing in any moment.
Well, I may as well start. Good afternoon, evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me back. Apologies for the voice; it's a bit croaky. I've got several slides. We'll fly through them because actually the things you really want to know about is what you can and can't do, and what the latest situation is. So I will just very quickly fly through. Next slide, please. If you could go on a couple of slides. As you know, next slide, we first confirmed disease on the 26th of August. Next slide, please. And as you know, in accordance with our published framework, we put in place a temporary control zone. That green circle is what that looks like. So that was our first case in Norfolk. And then we started looking to see whether there'd been any circulating virus. Next slide, please. What we found was that there was a few cases that we identified through surveillance, and very soon it became clear that there was some local transmission, i.e., and Chris will tell us more about that. So a UK midge had bitten an infected animal, and there had been some local transmission. So we immediately moved on to our next sort of phase in terms of outbreak control, and that was to put in place a restricted zone. So those temporary control zones were revoked and replaced by a restricted zone, initially covering Norfolk and Suffolk. Next slide, please. And as we started to understand better the epidemiology of this, and we could work out roughly when those first animals must have been infected, we looked back at some of our modelling as to where in the country we might be need to look for new cases, and that image on the right hand side is those modelled plumes that airborne or windborne midges could have come from. And at that time it was thought, well, it's pretty clear that Essex is also likely to be a high risk area, and we were starting to get some cases towards the border, so we extended the zone still further. Next slide, please. Next thing that found is that we got a report case up in East Yorkshire, and so the process started again, temporary control zone, looking for circulating virus, looking for the extent of disease, and we extended the zone slightly. Next slide, please. By this time, we were up to 38 cases. And as we detected more, we further expanded that temporary control zone, always looking to be ahead of the disease, because our control strategy is very about limiting the movement of infected animals. Next thing that we found is that we got a case in Kent, northern Kent. So again, following the same model, temporary control zone, looking to see whether there's circulating virus, and the image on the extreme right hand side is how the picture is looking. So you can very much see that pattern of infected cases being on the eastern counties. Next slide, please. It then became clear that there was some spread of disease in those South Essex, North Kent. So we expanded the restricted zone, and that's what it looked like on the 13th of September. And then yesterday, following the identification of 2 further cases in Kent and a case in East Sussex, we've extended the zone right down so that all of Kent, all of East Sussex is covered. And at the same time, and coincidentally, it became clear that there was circulating virus at a local level in that East Riding of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire area. And so again, following the same model, we revoked that temporary control zone, and we've now got 2 restricted zones. So one covering all of the East Riding of Yorkshire, plus 4 districts in Lincolnshire, plus Kingston upon Hull. So that's where we sit at the today. Next slide, please. So as of today, that's the position. So we've got 70 premises, 70 cases, all in those restricted zones, and we've got those 2 RZs. They're not joined up, and I'm sure there'll be some discussion about can you move between zones, etc. I think you know about the movement controls that are in place. Next slide, please. But I thought it was worth us just going through what you can and can't do in those zones. Next slide, please. So if you're in a restricted zone, and those are the 2, and you can find out on the interactive map if you're in or out. And just a reminder, if your premises is part in, part out, we consider you to be in. So you need to act as if all of your premises is within that zone. The things that we restrict are susceptible animals, and so those are all ruminants and all camelids, and their germinal products. Next slide, please. So what can you do? So if you are within a restricted zone and you want to move to slaughter, you don't need a license. to move to a slaughterhouse that is within that restricted zone, and that slaughterhouse doesn't need to be designated, but you can only move within that restricted zone. Technically speaking, there is a general license called a 612, which you do need to comply with, but it's not a Bluetongue control license, but you do need to be aware of that. But to all intents and purposes, you don't need a license to move within that zone. All other moves to slaughter, i.e. to move to slaughter outside a zone, you do need to comply with the general license, but that we'll cover that on the other other slide. Movements of susceptible animals into the restricted zone don't need a license, so you can move from outside into the zone, but once they're in that zone, they can't leave. Shows and gatherings can take place within that zone, but again, once they've attended that show or gathering or market, they cannot leave that zone. So you could have a market within the zone, and as long as those animals were sold within the zone, that's acceptable. And germinal products, the main thing about germinal products is you can't freeze on farm, you cannot freeze germinal products on farm, and you cannot move those germinal products out of a zone unless you have a license. Next slide, please. So if you're trying to move from within the zone to outside the zone, then you will absolutely need a license for all of those movements, and not all of them are available at the moment. So there is a general license that will allow you to transport an animal direct to a designated slaughterhouse outside of the zone in England or Wales. And there's a list of those on the gov.uk website, but just check with your normal abattoir, because there are one or two that either are just about to become designated or are designated, but have asked not to be put on the DEFRA website. Markets within the zone, I can't even see the slide from there. Apologies for that. So markets within the zone can use this license for a direct movement to a designated slaughterhouse. So if you've got a market in that zone and you've sold animals there, you can move from that market to a designated abattoir using that slaughter license. The general license doesn't apply if your premises is under restriction, and those are Bluetongue restrictions. If you've been served an EXD01 or an EXD02, those general licenses don't apply, and you would need a specific license. You'll know if you have been served one, but I do need to make that clear to you. So for all other movements, including movements to live outside the zone, you need to apply for a specific license. And you know how to do that. You apply through the APHA web portal, and you put in what move you want to do. If it's a movement to live, firstly, you need to be allocated that license. Then you'll need to request a pre-movement test. That is free of charge, provided it's done through an APHA provider. If your private vet is doing that, you'll need to pay for the vet to take those samples. And if that license is granted and those animals are negative, when they leave the zone and turn up on the destination farm, those animals will be placed under restriction, and they'll have to be tested again to check that they haven't become infected in that time between that pre-movement test and that subsequent test. At this moment in time, you cannot move animals out of a zone to a market or through a market if that market is outside the zone. Next slide, please. General licenses, I think you know all this, but basically make sure that if you're taking advantage of a general license, you've read it, make sure that it's relevant to the move that you want to make, and always print off a copy of that general license and either take it with you if you're taking those animals, or give it to your haulier to demonstrate that you are complying with that general license. As I said before, general licenses can't be used for any premises that's under premises restrictions. Next slide. I think we'll skip over this slide. A specific license is where it's granted for one or more specific moves, and it's specific to you, and you must comply with all the terms and conditions of that. Those take longer to issue. You should allow at least 5 days before asking for one. I think we'll probably skip over this because this might come up in questions, and I think I've probably covered most of that. Next slide. Just a little bit about vaccine and vaccination. Next slide. I'm conscious that time is going on. So I think, as you know, 3 vaccine products have been granted or been permitted for use in the UK, subject to them being issued with a license. Next slide. So these are the vaccines. I think it's just worth stressing that unlike some of the other authorized vaccines and some of the Bluetongue 8 and other vaccines, these vaccines are not designed to prevent infection. They will damp down clinical signs. They may well prevent or at least reduce mortality and reduce the impact on those animals, but they don't prevent the animal becoming infected, and they won't, and those animals are still potentially infectious. So from a disease control perspective, you would still need to comply with all the rules that I've just spoken about, even if you've vaccinated, and they won't facilitate trade. Next slide. So these vaccines you can find more details on the gov.uk website. And we've issued some advisory notes to vets to help them with their prescription. And the general license for using of those vaccines are also available online. That general license can be used anywhere within the high-risk counties. And again, we've discussed the high-risk counties before. If you're outside of a high-risk county, you'll need to apply for a specific license to be able to vaccinate. And reminder that all vaccines must be prescribed by a vet. And you will, once you've vaccinated, you'll need to tell us what you vaccinated by filling in a form and sending it to the centre. Next slide. I think we can probably skip over that, and I think we'll move on to Sascha now, because I think
Gordon,
we'll
thank you
cover
very
the
much for
questions
that.
afterwards.
Yeah, Gordon, thank you for that. There are a lot of questions popping up around vaccines, and movement licenses. So we'll try and pull those together for a minute. So Sascha, can we come to you and talk a bit more about clinical signs and the animals themselves?
Yeah, I'll just share my screen. Right. Right, sorry. My name's Sascha from Helvoort, and I work for Animal Plant Health Agency, and I work within the outbreak. I'm responsible for the strategic veterinary delivery within the field And just for those of you who might not know, you never know, Animal Plant Health Agency, we actually support the delivery of operations for DEFRA and so anything to do with animal and plant health. So I just want to quickly go through, for those of people who are on who haven't really been on any webinars, to remind them what the clinical signs are of Bluetongue. And it's a vector-borne exotic notifiable viral disease. And because it's notifiable, we are where we are now. It affects ruminants, so that's cattle, sheep, goats, deer. And it can also affect camelids, so like llamas and alpacas. The severity of the clinical signs really varies between species, breeds, and serotype, and we've actually seen that at present in the field. Not all of the ruminants will show clinical signs, and that's mainly the case with cattle. They show a lot less signs than sheep do. And the disease is associated with vectors, the Culicoides midge, in which the virus replicates. So Bluetongue, it can reduce milk yield in cattle. It can affect the reproductive performance in animals, obviously the growth. I mean, if they're ill, that will cause the growth to be affected. There's a variety of signs, but I'll come back to them. But equally, it can also look like other diseases we're concerned about, and that would be foot and mouth or Schmallenberg, which we had a lot over the winter. So our investigation centres had a lot of cases which they checked that they weren't also Bluetongue. It does not luckily affect people or food safety, so the meat and milk is safe to be eaten and drunk. There's a variety of different types. We don't only have BTV3. We had BTV8 in 2007 and 2008 outbreak, for those of you who remember, and that is still quite current in France at the present time. And there's also BTV1 and 4 as well. And as I said, it's spread by midges, but it can also be spread through germplasm. Like Gordon mentioned, so that's semen, ova, and embryos, and hence they are restricted as well. But it can also be spread by movements far away, so of affected animals that we don't know are infected. Just quickly on the transmission, so if you have the infected host here, so a midge can come along, an uninfected adult midge, and that's our vector. It bites the infected host. Then there's an incubation period of 4 to 20 days, and this is dependent on temperature, and warm weather is really not the best to have, because that means the time that the incubation period gets shortened, so they get infected quicker. Once they're infected, they are always infected, so the animal can bite, can infect several animals before it dies. When it goes and bites in a susceptible host, so an unaffected animal, then they will become infected. One bite can actually kill a sheep, and then takes 2 to 4 days, and then the host is infected, and the whole cycle can start again. So that's why at the minute we're, the weather has a big impact on this. So it's very dependent on the transmission. Is very dependent on the temperature. So the clinical signs that we've been seeing at present in England, there's a variety that we have, which we shared on the previous webinars, but these are I thought it'd be good to see what we've been seeing actually in the field. So with cattle, there's often animals can be affected without clinical signs, so we have seen that. They do show, if we do get them, they'll often show that they've got lameness or they have pain on their feet. They often show with red mouth and red nose, so the mucous membranes. They often have crusting on their nose, and there's a picture there on the right of a cow with that, and you can also see the redness as well. They have ulceration. They sometimes have ulcers in their mouth when you open them up. That does cause them pain, and so they might be salivating with that as well. Some of them have shown with swollen eyelids, and some we've had with redness on their teats, so that was obvious. There could be a milk drop. I've added that one in, but yeah, that was very clear in the Netherlands. And then we've had some die, but that might be due to other causes that were happening at the same time. So, so the death might not have been caused due to the Bluetongue, but didn't help the matters. For sheep, we're mainly seeing a lot of animals with nasal discharge. It can be either clear discharge coming out of the nose, but it can also be purulent, so a bit pussy. They're often depressed, they're often lying down, they've got swelling in their face and around their gums, their muzzle. That seems to be quite recurring. I have heard that sometimes that swelling goes away quite quickly. They are lame, they've also got ulcers in their mouth, like with the cattle, and crusting around their nostrils. We're seeing quite a bit of that. They do have temperature, and we've had some salivate quite extensively. They usually don't want to eat, and that's in relation to the ulcers in their mouth and just them not feeling very well. We've also seen bleeding of lips, and that's because the virus actually attacks the lining of the vessels in the body, so they literally just leak blood. Some of them have shown problems with breathing and discharge from their eyes, and we have had deaths of sheep. And here are some pictures. Here's the redness on the left of the teats there. We've seen redness of the nose here. This one's a lot more severe, crusting like on the previous photo. Ulceration in the mouth. Here, redness between the cloves of the hooves and thickening as well. And when you press that, they're often painful on that. For the sheep, obviously the ones lying down, they're really not happy. Here's one with a lot of saliva coming out of its mouth. Here's one with where it's actually been bleeding, and you can see the various ulcers and redness of the nose and muzzle area. And again, crusting here, the discharge out of the nose being a bit more purulent there, and a bit of swelling on the various ones. So when you see clinical signs, please report to us immediately. And also to help with any pain the animals are going through or any distress, there is really a need to treat the animals. So please call out your own vet as well so they can actually treat. We have seen that anti-inflammatories have been very helpful at an early stage for these animals and helps them to start eating a bit quicker. But there's only supportive therapy that you can do for them. There's nothing that we can do to stop the virus, so it's just a case of treating them for the signs that they are showing. The restrictions that are placed on your farm, they do not affect the private vet coming out, except if they feel that there might be foot and mouth, or any other notifiable disease that would warrant that they would have to stay on site. But please do get them in. Some of the animals we've been seeing are recovering, and some we have also seen get sick again, even though they had recovered. So then just quickly on what we're doing with APHA, we're going out to report cases as quickly as we can. There are tracing visits that we follow up where we know that there's been disease. We follow those animals if we can find any others elsewhere. And obviously there's surveillance visits here at the temporary control zone. So sorry, it's now just the RZ that's left in place, the restricted zone. Again, it's really difficult, the temporary land associations, so please make sure that you do look at that. If you do have temporary land, there's a lot of guidance out there, so please do go and find out about that, and I'm sure there is advice also for here on the website. And then for surveillance visits, just so you know, we sample up to 35 cattle and they are over 6 months of age. We don't select all farms, so just if you do get a phone call, then at least you know what to expect. And again, here's the phone number should you have any disease. So I shall stop sharing and thank you.
Sascha, that's great. Thank you for that. There are going to be a number of questions around clinical signs that we'll come to in a minute. Chris, I wonder if you could just pick up and make a few comments about the midges themselves. There are a number of questions around things like temperature, around overwintering, those sorts of considerations that we as farmers ought to be thinking about.
Okay, thank you, and good evening, everyone. So a very brief commentary on Culicoides midges. They're very small and they're very abundant on farms. We haven't got any farms that we've visited that have no midges, so they're pretty much ubiquitous in the UK. UK populations of midges are able to transmit this virus as well, so that's an important thing to note. We know that UK midges are capable. All the species are anyway. As Sascha said, the temperature is really important as a driving force of Bluetongue virus transmission. So that's because of two reasons. The first is that the midges themselves are dependent on temperature. So they live their lives much faster when it's warm. So they're more active, they'll bite more, they'll produce more generations in a year. And that means there's more biting pressure. But also, as Sascha was saying, that the virus has to replicate inside these midges in order to be transmitted. And that takes a period of time. And that period of time, the virus replication is dependent on that temperature. So in Northern Europe, this means that we get seasonal transmission of Bluetongue, where temperatures are greater than the replication threshold of Bluetongue virus. And that's around 12 to 15 degrees centigrade. So when it's warmer than that, we can get replication in the midges. When it's below that, we can't. And so those midges can't actually transmit the virus even if they acquire it. So that means that as we get closer to the winter and the temperature gets cooler, the rates of transmission will drop. Those midges that are already infected will still be able to infect animals, but new midges biting those infected animals won't be able to complete this replication of virus. And so as winter draws on, we should see less and less cases coming in. The issue with Bluetongue virus and other midge-borne viruses is, yes, in Northern Europe, they disappear for the winter, but then they come back in the spring. And this is the process of overwintering. And we don't know how this happens, essentially. There are theories and suggestions that it might be animals that are infected for a long period of time, or offspring of animals infected late in the season. We get transplacental transmission, so it passes from the mother to the offspring, and that calf or lamb is then born in the spring and could then pass on the infection to midges. Or it's possible that some midges actually survive the winter as adults. Most midges survive the winter as larvae, and all the adults die off. But there might be occasions and circumstances where infected midges can live a bit longer. We don't know what that is, but we know that it's possible in Northern Europe.
Chris,
so
on that point, there's a specific question, Chris, about vertical transfer. So could you say a little bit more about passing from mother to lamb through the placenta?
Yeah, so firstly, in terms of vertical transfer in midges, that we don't think that happens. So midges are born naive. They haven't got any transfer of virus from female midges to eggs and onto things. There have been some cases, particularly with Bluetongue 8, of transmission from the mother to the calf, and then the calf was born with a viremia, a normal infection, if you like, of Bluetongue virus that would have been able to then transmit to midges if they'd bitten the animal. There are interactions with maternal antibodies from colostrum, So it might depend if the animal receives colostrum, so that calf or lamb receives colostrum from its mother, because it might get protection from maternal antibodies. So it's very difficult to know exactly which animals may cause the virus to overwinter, but certainly pregnant animals might be at risk so positive pregnant animals might be seen as a risk of overwintering.
Chris, that's really helpful. Maybe if all the speakers come back on the screen, we'll try and get through many of these questions. I'm going to try and group them into sort of logical areas if I can. And I just remind everybody that if we don't get to your question, we will put the answers up afterwards. So go and look for them. There's questions, Gordon, around how widespread within the RZs are the cases. Are they near the edge? You know, if I'm close to the edge, should I be more worried? Should I be thinking about managing my animals in a different way? So, are the cases spread everywhere in an area, or are they in specific sort of collections? I think you're on mute, Gordon.
Whilst it's really quite an easy question, it's quite a difficult answer, because remember, you can have infected animals that are not showing clinical signs, but are infected and infectious and capable of spreading disease through midges, etc. So the clinical cases, i.e. where we've got report cases where we've got sick animals, are still predominantly along the east coast, down through Yorkshire, those Lincolnshire area, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, and along the north coast of Kent. But we've got one in East Sussex, which is sort of more in the middle of East Sussex. But where we've done surveillance in and around those areas, we've always found extra cases, and we've obviously been looking in cattle because that's where they're most likely to have bitten and have undisclosed disease. So just because you haven't got clinical disease next door to you in sheep, for example, doesn't mean to say that there isn't infected animals there. We're still comfortable that from the best we know, the vast majority of disease is within those zones, and it's tended to be to the east or the of those zones.
Okay, that's helpful, Gordon. There was one question that somebody asked about whether we could actually get a map of where the different cases are rather than just the zones. Is that publicly available?
So at the moment it isn't, but we are looking to have a static map, a bit like the Dutch map example, to show an indication of those cases. We've been holding back because when you've only got one or two cases, it starts to become quite easy to identify people, and we shouldn't, these midges were blown in. It's not as if it's poor biosecurity or anything. So we want to protect individuals. I think now we've got 70 cases.
You suspect in time we might see something more
No,
like the Dutch.
We'll definitely be putting something out there showing those sorts of cases. It may be another week or so, but that's
okay.
Definitely our plan.
Right, we'll hold you to that a week or so then. Questions about mortality rates. I saw reports on the continent of something like 25% mortality rates in sheep. Is that what we've been seeing, or is there a noticeable difference?
I mean, it might be worth Sascha coming in, but I think we've got to be careful when we say mortality. Is this case mortality? Is it farm mortality, or is it across the board? It's really difficult to start quoting those sorts of things. But I'll hand over to Sascha.
Sascha.
Yeah, it is difficult to tell. I think it's clear we're not having as many mortalities as in Holland, but that's all we can say. We can't give an exact figure because often we don't hear from further cases on farm. Like in the Netherlands, they have a system that's it's all integrated, so they know exactly how many mortalities there are, and we don't have that here in England. So we're relying on farmers to let us know, in all fairness, but
Okay,
it's
look,
definitely like less mortality.
before we get stuck into the myriad of movement questions, and I'm going to fire you individual examples on movement questions, can we talk a little bit more about vaccines? So here are a number of questions. Is the vaccine safe to use in all stages of gestation? Where can we access scientific studies on the efficacy and side effects of vaccine? Perhaps you might like to make a comment about the efficacy on the continent. I understand it's been variable. Are there any vaccine side effects that we ought to be aware of? Who wants to pick up the vaccine stuff?
I think it's very difficult for us to comment on, there are 3 different vaccines. They all make different claims. They've all got different claims. They've all got different doses. They've also got different frequencies. So I think that's something that prescribing vets are going to have to look at the equivalent of the SPC, the manufacturer's instructions to go forward. I don't think we can make those generic comments about vaccines. What the Veterinary Medicines Directorate have done, they've reviewed the information that's available for those 3 vaccines, and they're content that in terms of safety and efficacy and the claims that are being made, given that this is still an unauthorized vaccine, and given that the constraints that it's working within, that they are safe to use, but they're not making claims to prevent infection. Their claims are to reduce viremia, to reduce clinical signs, and I think one of them might claim to prevent mortality.
There seems to be... sorry, Sascha, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just add to the gestation that states on the data sheet for all 3 products that they are safe to be used in pregnant animals. This is different for breeding males, so that needs to be discussed with the vet, should they be used in those kind of animals.
And I understand that the length from first jab to potential immunity is a number of weeks we're talking about. So if we had a frost here in Oxfordshire the other night, if our temperature drops, perhaps we as farmers need to be thinking about these vaccine strategies potentially for next season, as much as we're thinking about it for the current outbreak. Would that be a fair comment?
I think that's definitely something to talk to your vet. Obviously, where things are, the temperatures will slow down, and it does take that time to develop onset of immunity. So yes, I think that's definitely worth talking to your private vet. And you've got to think about, the cost of these. You've got to think about the practicalities of administering as well. So all things to talk to your vet about whether it's right for you.
Okay, there's a couple of questions around the number of cases that are being reported and whether it's been picked up through clinical signs or surveillance. Is there there's a mix there? What is it roughly? But somebody has questioned that whether there are very few cases being reported on the continent. Seems to be more in the UK. I have to say that wasn't my understanding of what I've read, but have there been many cases on the continent? Are we getting away with more or less in this country?
We've got a hell of a lot less than they have in the continent. We've got 70 cases. Last week alone, the Netherlands confirmed 500 cases, and it was 900 the week before that. And
is that 70? Is that 70 infected farms or 70
yes.
infected animals, Gordon? So okay,
it's variable. But most of them are premises.
Right.
So we've got a lot less. In terms of the numbers, you've got to be really careful. But I think of those 70, 44 of them were directly through report cases, so clinical disease. The others were either surveillance or tracings, etc.
Okay,
I'm
look,
sure that we would find more if we went sampling every animal.
Okay, let's move on to these movement questions, because there are loads of them, and I'm going to try and pick a sample out which sort of seem to be common links. Okay, so here's one question. We sell and deliver rams to purchasers' own farms. I know who this question's from, and I know that their farm is outside the zone. We have a number of clients throughout the restricted zone waiting for their purchased rams, which they wish to use this autumn. Are we able to deliver rams to more than one client in a given part of the restricted zone, or are we only allowed to enter the restricted zone and to deliver to one farm on each journey? I guess this is about risk. Anybody like to comment?
I'm going to have to take that one away because I can't remember the specifics of that general license. We'll come back to you. I don't want to mislead.
And I think you've said before, Gordon, I think Sascha said before on these events, that it's very much a case-by-case basis, particularly if you're looking to move from inside to outside for stock that's not going to slaughter, so for breeding stock. I'm aware that quite a lot of stock seems to be moving around the country as people try to perhaps get ahead of things. So you'll look on things from a licensing point of view on a case-by-case basis. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and it'll be risk-based. Movements to live would be movements from a zone into England, and they would be subject to pre and post movement testing. We would urge people not to move things if they don't need to, because, as I said before, an infected animal moving around is the way to move the disease around far further and quicker than waiting for a midge to bite another midge and they'll go through the incubation period and then fly on locally.
What is higher risk? What's higher risk, Gordon? The movement of animals or the movement of people? And what should people be doing? Chris, maybe you'd like to comment as well about the use of insecticides. One or two questions about what product should I buy? What should I be looking for in my farm supplies?
So I'm not worried about people.
Yeah, movement of people is not an issue. So the problem with midge-borne diseases, as we mentioned, is the midges are everywhere. They're really difficult to control, and there's no evidence that insecticidal application on animals or residual spraying has any effect on bluetongue transmission. The one area where insecticide use is required by the licensing, and Gordon can correct me if I'm wrong on this, is for the cleansing, essentially, of trailers that are moving animals. So if animals are being moved, we need to make sure that no midges are coming with those animals. The insecticides that can kill midges, so the pyrethrins, the pyrethroid, synthetic pyrethroid insecticides, can kill midges, but the reason they don't work in the field is because the time over which they're active is very short, and particularly sort of getting contact between the insecticide and the midges is very, very difficult to achieve, especially in the UK weather, with animals outside in the rain and sunshine. So that's why protecting animals doesn't appear to work. But if we can eliminate that risk of moving midges with animals by using insecticides, because it's only for a short period of time that we're going to do that, then that's worth doing.
And we should be clear that we're applying the insecticide to the vehicle and not to the animal. Yeah. And so we're very mindful of that. A number of these products have quite long withdrawal periods. And so, be very careful, look at the labels for everything you use, and don't apply it to an animal if it's obviously you're looking to move to slaughter in the near future, for example. And that's why it's very clear, apply it to the body of the vehicle, allow it to dry before you load the vehicle.
I think you would all concur with the point that's been made in the questions, that you consult with your private vet, your vet on the circumstances on your farm, about pain relief, about whether euthanasia is appropriate. That would be a consultation with your vet who understands your local situations. That would be a fair comment, wouldn't it?
Yes, it really would. And I mean, to reiterate, the animals are in a lot of pain, and often they just go downhill really quickly. We've seen it in Holland, where they actually, after a period of time, they realized that some of these animals weren't going to get any better, so they actually euthanize at a quicker stage. But I think it's important, you know, here we seem to be having milder signs, and it's really important to get pain killing into the animals as soon as possible. So that's the anti-inflammatories.
Helpful, thanks, Sascha. Chris, can I
And
ask you just to clarify a point again, because it's coming up regularly in the questions. What do you mean by insecticides? Do you mean sheep dip? Do you mean porons? Do you mean aerosols?
So the use of aerosols is really heavily regulated and shouldn't be used in this circumstance. So we're talking about the use of poron insecticides that have not been shown to be efficacious against Bluetongue virus transmission. There's also the residual insecticides, which is the ones we need to use on trailers and vehicles. Yeah, we're not talking about dipping. That's not appropriate either. And widespread insecticide use of any of these products carries significant environmental impacts as well. So we do need to be aware of that. And that's why insecticide use against sculicoid is because they are everywhere and they'll breed in most of damp organic matter. There's no way we can go around a farm and treat every single place where midges might breed without hugely damaging the farm ecosystem.
One more, we're coming up to our time. Look, one more movement question, and I would reiterate that we've had many questions, and we will try and answer them all so people can look at them later. We are in the restriction zone, and due to lamb at Christmas, we have a temporary holding in a shed on another farm. Will we be able to move into this? It's normally shared with cattle. This sounds to me like sheep moving from one holding to another, but within a restriction zone. Gordon.
So it's difficult to know without the circumstances, but if it's within a restriction zone and neither premises is under premises restrictions, then that's fine. And there's a general license for that, or you don't need one at all, depending on what sort of zone it is.
There's some comments I noticed from Tony Goodyear in the comments about abattoirs and abattoir licensing. I know that came up earlier on. We'll try and highlight those, Tony, for people who have particular interests around abattoirs, again in the answers that we publish afterwards. Look, thank you, all three of you, for your contribution this evening. It's been really helpful. I have to say, it helps me to hear it 2 or 3 times before some of these messages sink in. Some of the takeaways for me are around our biosecurity and our record keeping, of course. Perhaps you could put up the last slide for me. Just so that we could finish. So those issues around biosecurity and record keeping are particularly important. I would suggest to everybody ensure that they are on the APH alert system. That has been really helpful. We're also very conscious, look, that this is a challenging time for many people. So on the slide, you should see a number of logos, some websites, and some telephone numbers of people who are able to help if you're finding this a particularly challenging period. Please don't sit there and feel you're in isolation. All of these people will be happy to help. And as I mentioned earlier on, all of those technical bits of information are available through either the AHDB website or the Rumen Animal Health and Welfare site. So look, thanks again for everybody for logging on this evening. We hope that's been useful. Give us some feedback about areas that you think more coverage, and we will continue to do these webinars depending on how things progress over the coming weeks. Thanks again to everybody in the team in the background who have put things together for tonight, and I hope you all have a very good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Good night.